Salim, at the time of this recording, it's was it March 24th at 5:30 p.m. And I say that because things happen so rapidly with this coronavirus pandemic that's going on. This particular discussion we want to have, I think, should focus on the leadership of President Donald Trump as compared to the rest of the leadership in the world from the other countries, and perhaps even, and this is where your expertise comes in, leaders in the past and their characteristics and what they had to do. And I'll start off the discussion, if I may, by just mentioning that not too long ago, just moments ago, from my perspective when I saw it, Donald Trump came out and said that he wants to see the United States open for business again by April 12th. That would be Easter Sunday, 2 weeks and 5 days from now. And people are losing it, thinking that, why, you can't do that. I think you told me Piers Morgan over in the UK was blasting Trump for daring to suggest that this ever end. And I think that there's a lot of authoritarianism and collectivism and communism going on for the people who object to this because they're in their element. They love this total crackdown on businesses and people's movement to the point where Justin Trudeau has not dismissed surveilling people by the use of their cell phones, albeit supposedly with non-personal information. But you can never trust a person like him who loves communist China and has said so. So let's talk about the leadership of Donald Trump and this bold move by giving people, I'll say the word again, hope, which is how I ended off our last video from yesterday, giving people hope that and reassurance that no matter what happens here, the business of life has to go on. So tell us, Salim, what kind of a leader is Donald Trump to be distancing himself from the pack of the globalists, the collectivist leaders of the world who just want nothing more than to seize power and use this as a pretext to ratchet up their drift towards globalism?
You're very right, Robert. And I don't know what is the number in terms of our conversation that we have had over the last several days, this particular one that we are doing. In my mind, I think we have done several conversations that you have posted. And all through the while, in our conversation, in the back of my mind, and also right in front of me, in the sense of this has been playing out, is the question of leadership. We are in a state of war, but a state of war against an invisible microbe that seemed to threaten the whole world, coming out of China. And while the world was in a sense sleeping, and this microbe had woken up and spilled into the Chinese society and was creating havoc over there, our media was not focused on it. They were focused on something totally different. Our media, I mean the North American media.
Yes, the impeachment.
Particularly, yes, the corporate media, which is what they have been focused on for the last almost 4 years now. We are in the 4th year of Trump's presidency. How to maneuver public opinion in a manner that will lead to the model that they are living with, the hope that the media has been living with, the CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of that, is that the public outrage, if they can create and generate, would lead to the exhaustion of the man in the White House, that is Donald Trump, in the manner in which Nixon was driven out of the White House in 1974. We go back to history to see, and there was the whole situation of Nixon's culpability in the Watergate burglary, And the question was, when did he know it, and what did he do about it? That was the question that ultimately Nixon could not answer, and he was going to be impeached when he was told by the Republican leadership in the Senate and in the House, who went to him and said, "You have lost the party in the House, and there is going to come down the articles of impeachment, and it will be voted upon, and they will convict you." And on getting that message, Nixon decided to resign and hand over the presidency to his vice president, Gerald Ford. Now that's the scene, the scenario, which millennials don't know because they were not born at that time, and the history that they have learned is what the media tells them. So anyhow, that's the model, that's the situation which the media has been working over time, which is what we now know, the deep state and all the various forces in America plugged into the deep state. The intelligence community, the people in the Democratic Party, the media, the never-Trumpers, and so on and so forth. And of course, the billionaire oligarchs like Michael Bloomberg and Jeff Bezos and others, to bring about a situation where the Republican leadership, and many of them are still never-Trumpers, they would go to the White House and say, "Mr. President, you have lost the support. You're going to be impeached. The article of impeachments are being drawn out. You will be voted. The vote will be not in your favor. You will be convicted, and you will be removed." Well, we saw the drama played out. In all of this last 2.5, 3 weeks, the whole month of March, maybe people have forgotten that. But we saw that. It's only a few months ago, in the month of December and January, while the COVID-19 was exploding in China, that this drama was being played out. The articles of impeachment was voted upon. It was brought to the Senate. There was a trial held. But lo and behold, everything that has been thrown at Donald J. Trump since he was elected, and even during the primary season, has been deflected. Now, historians of the future, the old saying in the Bible, we are in the month of the Lent, and we are heading into Easter. So it is worthwhile to quote the Bible. No man is recognized, or no prophet is recognized in his city in his own time. So it'll be left to the future historians to come back and look at this without any prejudice and look at it with facts. But I believe that the man in the White House is providential. And why I say that he is providential is not something that, I cooked it out of my head. One of the great American historian and political philosopher, Samuel Martin Lipset, has written about this. I was an undergraduate student when I sat in on some of his lecture when he was visiting University of Toronto, a giant of a man and a giant of a thinker. And he observed that America, in some ways, is providential, that the hands of God is at play in American history. And when the times required providential engagement, the man came about, and he points out to George Washington, to Abraham Lincoln. And we might add to that, this was when Ronald Reagan had just stepped down, so the historical perspective was not there. I would add Ronald Reagan to that list that Samuel Martin Lipset had in his mind. And now I feel quite confident, Robert, to add Donald J. Trump to that list.
Are there other populist leaders throughout history who've had the guts to take the information that's given to him and make a decision and stand by the decision? Because what I'm seeing here in this country, Canada, is that our policy is driven by doctors. And it's the same old adage that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, to a doctor, they only have one goal in mind, and that is to save lives. And it doesn't matter what they have to do that. If they had their way, we would all self-isolate from now till kingdom come. Because then there would be no deaths, except from starvation and boredom. So you can't have doctors make policy. Now, Donald Trump is listening to the advice from doctors, but he's also weighing that with the advice from the rest of society, the businessmen, the workers. And he's saying at some point in time there has to be a trade-off. And he's at least one leader who's willing to say this far and no farther. April 12th is the day, that we've stopped basically trying to flatten the curve. And then we have to let the economy recover, because the consequences would be dire if we don't. Do you agree?
It is simply a default position, Robert, that the man in the White House, whoever it is, by default becomes a leader of the free world, because the United States is the leader of the free world. And that's what, in this struggle that we have been headed into, and President Trump has been warning since before he became the president, and that is what he has been focused on, is there are forces out in the world which seeks to dislodge the United States from its position of leadership of the free world. And I say that free world, I'm not, free world, if you put it together, is a very small portion of this planet. Whoever is the man in the White House is the leader, but we have seen so many different leaders. We saw, for instance, in our lifetime, Jimmy Carter's presidency tanked, not because, like Nixon, that there was crime or suspicion of crime and the breakdown of trust, and he lost the support of his own party that forced him to resign. In the case of Carter, he couldn't handle the crisis. The crisis was the Iranian Revolution that led to the hostage crisis of the Americans held hostage for 444 days. And he, in a sense, was frozen like a deer caught in the headlights. We had Obama talking about red lines, drawing red lines, but he couldn't execute his red lines, We had Bill Clinton. These are all on record. Bill Clinton, who was informed that Osama bin Laden was in the crossfire. It was the question of whether the people who had him in the crossfire had the authority to pull the trigger on him. And Bill Clinton said no, he didn't go along with this. This was in 1998, as opposed to when, and you and I talked about this, when President Trump took out Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, Iranian, who has been engaged in the most brutal terrorist warfare right across the Middle East. And his fingerprints are all over, in a sense, the world with Iranian-backed terrorism has taken place. So the difference of leadership is what we're talking about. And we come back to Ronald Reagan. It's very interesting. You raised the name, Robert, and it's in the back of my mind. It's on the thing I wanted to pull out, but you very rightly mentioned Maggie Thatcher.
Yeah, the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands came to mind. Decisive.
Precisely. I mean, others would have frozen, as Jimmy Carter did. So yes, I mean, I flip back to Donald Trump. The man meets the moment, and the moment needs a man, and here it is. I mean, in every circumstance. One thing I want to on this thought, I want to put right up front. We are living in a world, Robert, at least since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet Union collapsed, if you recall, Robert, when President Reagan, I keep coming back to President Trump, President Reagan in his famous Berlin speech, standing on across from the wall, said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was Ronald Reagan who said that he's going to build up the Star War defense, and everybody laughed at him. I remember that so distinctly. I had just graduated and gone into the workforce in the second term of Ronald Reagan. I just finished my doctorate and gone to Ottawa to serve at a think tank over there that was attached to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time. It was built by one of the last act of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and I was a research fellow there for a little while. And I remember being in Ottawa and the skepticism, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau was still the prime minister, the skepticism of the people in Ottawa, especially, the liberals and the left. And I was at that time, I had voted for Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1979 election, and I had voted for Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1980 election.
It's funny you mentioned that. My experience was in the 1980 election, he came to my university in Newfoundland, and I went there and I heckled the man. Of course, being a 20-something, that's what you do. Or actually, not 20-something, I think I was 17, 18. But yeah, so you vote for the man, I go and heckle him. I was right in the long run, I think.
No, but it is the circumstances of the time, and you are a born Canadian, or you're a born Newfoundlander, and your coming of age was in different circumstances than mine. And though I did not have at that time as much of a depth of understanding of Canadian culture and history that I've acquired ever since, and I've devoted myself to it, and I see myself as as an unhyphenated Canadian. But in 1979 election, and leading up to the 1979 election, the context was Quebec separatism, René Lévesque, referendum, and so on and so forth. And though the name Trudeau at this point in time, almost 50 years later, 45 years later, whatever, creates a tremendous distaste in the minds of lots of people across Canada, especially in Western Canada, for very genuine reason. But again, putting things in perspective, we have to be fair. I have to be fair. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a man of the moment in that particular circumstances. I don't think anybody else in Canadian politics. Can you imagine Joe Clark going head to head with René Lévesque? We are at a time, at least for the past 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was brought about in a sense by the policies that was pursued by Ronald Reagan. He was the last of the Cold War warrior and patriot in that sense of the term. And he was heckled and he was jeered, and the same crowd in Hollywood and the same Democrats in the Congress sort of smeared him. I remember going into class when I was at university, and a lot of my professors were expatriate Americans and telling us, and we were impressed because what did I know at that time about, and people of my age at that time, that here is a man who is going to be the president of America, and his most famous act was playing Bonzo with the chimp or something like that.
Bedtime for Bonzo. I think Bonzo was the chimp, yes.
You got it right. Bedtime for Bonzo, yeah. And so his intelligence was, attacked, and he was attacked, personally attacked, and so on and so forth. And again, we can see that happening with Donald Trump. But for 30 years, where have we been, from George Herbert Walker Bush, who was part of the greatest generation, but who was, in a sense, the man who pushed the New World Order. So from George Herbert Walker Bush, who succeeded Ronald Reagan, till Donald Trump, there's almost 30 years, the West has been an orphan. That's the point I'm trying to drive at when it comes to leadership. Look around us. Who do we have? Macron in France, who considers himself a Napoleon Bonaparte, the short, small man's, psychological problems. You know, you have Angela Merkel, who has brought basically ruin to the European Union with her policies that has precipitated this immense crisis in Europe, which COVID-19 has worsened it. Where was Theresa May or the British after Maggie Thatcher? After Maggie Thatcher, Britain has been, in terms of leadership, a wasteland, and we cannot still decide about Boris Johnson. We have to wait and see. Historians will have to wait and see. He took action on Brexit, but this guy was in the cabinet of Theresa May. And of course, what can we talk about the Americans? You've had Bill Clinton, you've had George Bush, Obama. The West has been devoid of leadership. You go back, again, we're talking about decisiveness and about people and policy. You had, in the 1930s, a man on a wheelchair afflicted with polio who rose to the occasion. That is FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. There's nothing to fear but fear itself was his rallying cry in the midst of the Great Depression as he became the president in the inauguration of 1933. And then his leadership right through to support Churchill when America was still a neutral country, until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And then the leadership that he displayed, confined to the wheelchair. But again, the man met the moment and the moment needed a man, and there was FDR. And of course, the greatest prime minister in modern history, Winston Churchill. This was a man who was abused, who was neglected, who was confined. In a sense, he was never sent to the back benches, but as Churchill himself wrote about in his memoirs or in his books, he called it the wilderness years, the 1920s and 30s, and nobody paid attention to him. He warned and he warned and he warned. And by the way, look at the similarity. Churchill warned Britain and the rest of the world about the rise of fascism in Europe. But when the time came, when the moment came, the man met the moment and the moment needed the man, and there was Winston Churchill, at the darkest hour when the British Army was beleaguered on the shores of Dunkirk, encircled, and France had fallen or was about to fall. Churchill becomes the prime minister. And then the rest is history. So it is in that context I've been thinking about, and thanks for this conversation that you invited me to get together with you, that Donald Trump is the man at this time. And this is going to be the turning point in terms of American history and his own history, his own biography, that in this winter and spring of 2020, the page will have been turned. We don't know how the details will work out, but we can say confidently, the poll numbers are already showing that the public is behind, the American public is behind, despite every effort of the corporate media and the Democrats. The American public is behind President Trump. The numbers are very encouraging. It is up in the mid-50s, and if that sort of number is sustained, and I don't see any reason why it won't be sustained, he will be reelected. And he will launch America. The America will come back. So your opening remarks about that President Trump today, he tweeted, and you read the tweet in our previous conversation, and now he has confirmed that he wants America moving again by Easter. It is very symbolic. Easter is about not only the crucifixion, of Jesus, the Son of Man, the Son of God. That's theological discussion, but there it is historically. So it is about death, and it is about awakening, rebirth. So Jesus is crucified. Pontius Pilate washes his hand, and then Jesus is resurrected on Easter Sunday. And I think this is so symbolic that what we are seeing, in terms of metaphor, that the American economy, the American people will rise in full energy and full force. The crisis possibly is not over, but a number of steps has been taken. We have hinted about that in our previous conversation, but let me draw it out here a little further. We are hearing from the media that there has been some degree of tension or disagreement within the president's task force in terms of whether there is a fallout or whether there is some sort of a relationship that has been in some ways dented. We have to take it with a lot of grain of salt, but that's what the media is playing, and I'm referring it to Dr. Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, who has been the point man. And one of the things that has been pointed out is that Dr. Fauci went public he has been on the media regularly, and I believe it was on CNN that Dr. Fauci talked about the results of the usage of chloroquine as anecdotal, that these has not been run through any test trials. But there have been write-ups. Group of doctors at the Stanford University Medical School, or from the Stanford University Medical School, the University of Alabama, at the Birmingham School of Medicine, and the National Academy of Sciences. Recent guidelines from South Korea and China report that chloroquine is an effective antiviral therapeutic treatment against coronavirus disease 2019, etc., and that it can be used for prophylactic measure and also for the treatment of people on testing are showing that they have the coronavirus in them, they are infected by them. So this was the debate that was partly going on. The Chinese and the South Koreans have used the anti-malarial drug to flatten out their curve. The Japanese, I believe, have been using it, and the Japanese haven't gone into the same sort of lockdown as most of us in the West have done. And today I saw the report from Britain. And the government of UK went public on their website, Government UK, that they have downgraded COVID-19 from high consequence infectious diseases to being treated as another strain of flu virus, though more severe and serious, but no longer HCID, high consequence infectious diseases. Now, President Trump is the man, ultimately he has to make the decision. The government makes the decision. As Truman said, the buck stops here. So the president has to make the decision. And that was, I think, part of what the media has been reporting, Dr. Fauci's sense of a little bit of being disgruntled. And he did not appear on the daily briefing in the White House. He didn't appear over the weekend. And so the question arose, what has happened to Dr. Fauci? President Trump has approved the usage of chloroquine with the American doctors, both for prophylactic purposes and for treatment. And by the way, the drug had the FDA approval going all the way back to 1940. And so the drug was being used for malaria and related issues, but now it can be used for treating COVID-19. And on that note, there's one more sort of addendum. The British government has put a complete blockade, a stop of any export of chloroquine from Britain. So that means that the British government is also using this anti-malarial drug. We can see that President Trump has been very calm. He has been very decisive. And as it is said, Robert, that you cannot leave war, which is a very serious business, simply to the generals. You cannot leave fighting a pandemic simply to the doctors. And that's exactly what it is. The decision coming down from the White House, and at this point in time in the White House is Donald J. Trump, who is proving himself to be the man of the moment.
There's another aspect of that chloroquine I wanted to look into when I was reading some of the mainstream media's comments about it, suggesting that people have died from taking it. And if you look into it, people are eating chloroquine phosphate or phosphorus from fish tank cleaners, and there was a case of a Nigerian man dying from it apparently. And people are saying that Donald Trump was being reckless by promoting the use of this particular drug. So I went into his actual speech, his presentation, and he did not promote it at all. He said that he's working with the FDA, that they want to use it for clinical trials, that he has high hopes for it, and of course he's being optimistic, nothing wrong there, and that it can only be used with a prescription under supervision of a doctor. So again, he is being misquoted in the press and maligned in the press. And just going back to your earlier comments that there are forces in this world who want to see that man gone, and it doesn't matter how much they have to lie, cheat, steal, or kill to do it. But I'm glad we have this conversation, Salim. We're obviously in agreement that Donald Trump certainly is a man for the moment and one of the world's greatest leaders. And I will say that unequivocally. Today, he's probably the greatest leader. Certainly, I think the most formidable and greatest leader that I've seen in my lifetime. And of course, we lived through Ronald Reagan, but I put Donald Trump above Reagan.
As we reflect on this, you and I, and we share our thoughts on this, I feel that as a Canadian, we are an orphan when it comes to leadership. The man who is sitting in the Parliament and occupying 24 Sussex, the less said about him, the better. And the more invisible he becomes, the better, because it will be the hand of President Trump that will be guiding all of us. But our situation right now is absolutely appalling, where we are and where we have arrived, which in some sense goes back to the other observation. I don't want to take too much time. I don't know how much time you have, Robert, but I just want to put it on the table for people to reflect upon. And maybe we'll come back in some other conversation. The leaders that emerge also emerge because the people emerge with them. In 2016 election, Donald Trump, under just every scenario that was discussed and talked about in the mainstream media, even on the evening and night of the election, as people, that is the mainstream media, had their pundits sitting around the table, pontificating and discussing and analyzing the result coming in on November the 8th, 2016. as the evening began and as it progressed, everybody had their champagne glass ready, that Hillary Clinton is finally going to crack that invisible ceiling of glass and will be the first woman president in America, her lifelong ambition, and that the Obama administration, that Obama will have his third term, and so on and so forth. And the people that were invisible, the people that nobody paid attention to, the people that Hillary Clinton called the deplorables, those people rallied forth in Middle America, forgotten America, in the Appalachian Mountains and towns from where Americans have sent the young men to fight in distant countries to save freedom. Well, those people who were discounted by the coastal elite, they came through. It is they, and their bonding with Donald J. Trump is so visible in all the rallies that we have been witnessing, which again, the mainstream media wants to destroy, but there has been that bonding that we have to understand. The same sort of bonding that came about during the worst nights and evenings and days, the Battle of Britain, when Churchill talked about never in the history had so many owed so much to so few. In those moments of true disasters, being bombed every moment of the day, never knowing, when the next bomb or the bullet is coming for you, a bonding took place between the people on the island, Britain, and Winston Churchill. I think, again, historians will look back upon this moment, but we are writing history just as Daniel Defoe was writing history in his diary, about the Black Plague. You and I, we are talking in nothing similar to that, but this will be known as the year of the COVID-19 going forward. 2020 will be the year of COVID. So we are, in a sense, writing the first draft of history, and in that we are sharing our views and our feelings. And I think there is a special bond that is being forged once again between the people and Donald J. Trump.
Good place to leave it. Thank you very much, Salim.
Thank you.